A dark alley in the city center, the night filled with a disturbing hum of distant cars, and the vague whisper of rain that was just beginning to drizzle. A black woman, dressed in a casual coat, walked quickly, holding a bag of groceries. Her eyes constantly slid from side to side. She felt that something was wrong. Her intuition was right. 3 men appeared from around the corner, their laughter loud and rough, as if they already felt like they had won some strange, evil scenario. They were all white, wearing identical leather jackets that emphasized their affiliation with a local gang. Their faces expressed a mixture of contempt and mockery, and their eyes burned with the kind of hatred that arises not from reason, but from emptiness. "Hey, you!" one of them called out, his voice cutting through the night air. The woman stopped, her breathing becoming ragged. She knew that turning around would be acknowledging their presence, but instinct forced her head to turn. "What do you want?" she said, trying to keep her voice firm, but there was a hint of alarm in it. The men laughed, their laughter like blows, rough and painful. One of them stepped closer, his face twisted in contempt. He asked, holding up his hands in mock innocence. "Nothing special, just walking past someone like you and not saying a word. Isn't that rude? Do you even know where you are?" Another added, his voice low and menacing. "This is no place for you." She tried to take a step back, but one of the men blocked her path. At that moment, her fear became almost tangible, but she did not allow it to completely overwhelm her. "I'm not looking for trouble," she said, her voice shaking but still trying to sound firm. "I just want to get home." "Oh," the third of them, the tallest, grinned. "And are you sure that there should be a place here for people like you?" Those words, filled with venom, carried their entire intent. This was no simple case of street rudeness. They chose her because she did not fit their idea of who had the right to exist in this place. "You think you can walk around here like this is your city?" the first one continued, his voice growing louder. "This is our city. You are not needed here." The woman felt her breathing quicken. She tried to turn and walk away, but one of them grabbed her arm. His grip was rough, and she felt her bag fall to the ground. Oranges and boxes scattered across the wet sidewalk, but no one paid attention. "You're not leaving until we tell you," the second one said, his face serious. "You have to understand who's in charge here." They surrounded her, their figures like walls that were getting closer. Her heart was beating so loudly that it felt like it could break through. She tried to break free, but that only caused more laughter. "You think you can resist?" The tallest of them smirked. "People like you always think they mean something, but you're nothing." Those words hit her harder than their rough grip had. Her fear peaked in that moment, but something else began to form alongside it. A feeling she couldn't quite explain yet, but it was there. A quiet but powerful force that hadn't quite managed to break through yet. They continued to mock, their words becoming more and more harsh, more and more humiliating. The night around them was dark and empty, and it seemed that no one would come to their aid. But in the shadows, far from their sight, someone was watching, and this someone was not going to stay away. The alley was getting tighter, as if the very walls around the woman were closing in, pushed by the shadow of the 3 men surrounding her. Their laughter was no longer just a sound. It was a heavy weight that could not be avoided. The black woman, feeling her heart tighten, tried to take a step back, but one of the men immediately blocked her path. "Where are you going?" the first one drawled, leaning closer. His voice was mocking, but there was something icy in it. "You're not done with us, are you?" She tried not to meet his gaze, but there was a challenge in the second man's eyes that was impossible to ignore. "Why did you even come here?" he asked, his tone sharp. "You think you belong here? This is a place for people like us, not people like you." The woman tightened her grip on the bag she had managed to lift from the ground. She knew that words could be a weapon, but her voice still trembled. "I'm not bothering anyone," she said quietly, trying to remain firm. "I just want to go home." The third man, the tallest of them, laughed, and his laughter was heavy, like a feast hitting a table. "Home?" he asked, stepping closer. "You know what? I don't think this is your home. This is no place for someone like you." She tried to get around them, but again ran into one of them, who came even closer, almost touching her face with his. "Don't you understand?" he said, his voice rougher. "We're telling you clearly, this is not for you. You have to get out of here, and fast, or perhaps you're waiting for an invitation." The first added, his eyes blazing with mockery. "Perhaps you think you can behave here as if you were in your own hut." The words cut to the quick. The woman felt her hands shaking, but she held on. She took a step back, but hit the wall again. Their circle grew even tighter. "Look," she said, trying to remain firm. "I don't want any trouble. Just let me go." "Problems," the second one drawled, his voice mocking. "We are your problem, and we will solve it for you." The third leaned towards her, his grin unpleasant. "Be grateful we're even talking to you," he said. "People like you don't even deserve this." Her breathing became ragged, but she met his gaze. "People like me," she said, her voice shaking but full of challenge. "People like me work here. People like me live here just like you. What makes you think you have the right to decide where I should be?" The words, though spoken with a shudder, came out louder than she had expected. There was a moment of silence. The men looked at each other, their grins momentarily fading, but then they returned with renewed vigor. "She thinks she can argue with us," the first one said with a snort. "That's cute. Maybe she needs to be reminded who's in charge here," added the second. The woman felt her fear give way to something else. It was a feeling she couldn't describe, but it kept her standing, even when everything inside her screamed at her to run. But before either of them could take another step, something in the alley changed. Footsteps sounded in the distance, heavy, confident. They were getting closer with each passing moment. The men noticed it first. Their faces, full of self-confidence, began to change. One of them turned around, trying to figure out who was coming, but apparently the presence of a third person was not part of their plans. "Who's there?" the first one shouted, his voice louder than he had probably intended. The footsteps grew louder. The woman felt her fear mingle with hope. She didn't know who was coming, but she instinctively knew that it could change everything. The men looked at each other, their confidence fading. It was a moment when the alley frowned in anticipation, and everything could change in a second. The footsteps that had been heard from far away died away, and with them the hope that had barely managed to spring up in the woman's heart faded. The men surrounding her looked at each other. Their smug grins returned, and the tension dissolved for a moment. The one standing closest leaned in so close that she could smell his tobacco breath on her face. "Listen," he said, his voice low and harsh. "You're not here because we wanted to talk. You're here because we let you be here, and you have to remember that." Her breathing became ragged, but she stood up straight, trying not to show weakness. She knew that any words would only make the situation worse, but silence seemed even worse. She met his gaze, and it caused another burst of laughter among her attackers. "Are you trying to prove something to us?" smirked the other one, who was a little further away. "Do you think that if you look us in the eye, we'll change our minds? It's funny. Maybe she just wants to be pitied," the third added mockingly, pushing her with his shoulder so that she lost her balance, but managed to stay on her feet. The woman picked up the bag, which was still lying on the ground, and hugged it to herself, as if it was the only protection from their words and looks. Her voice trembled, but she still said, "Please, I just want to leave." "Leave," the first repeated, his face distorted with a malicious grin. "You're already here, in our place, and you think you can just leave?" Her hands shook, but she held onto the bag, as if it were her last link to her dignity. Her silence only spurred them on. One of the men snatched the bag, and the groceries scattered on the ground again. Oranges rolled across the wet asphalt. A milk carton fell and spilled, mixing with the rain. "Oh, sorry," he said mockingly. "You probably wanted to eat it." She bent down to pick up the groceries, but another kicked the orange, causing it to roll away. "Look at her," he laughed, crawling around like she's looking for a handout. The woman stopped, her face red with humiliation, but she straightened up again. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, her voice hoarse but firm. These words caused an unexpected pause. The men looked at each other for a moment, but then one of them stepped forward, his face serious again. "Because we can," he replied, "and you won't do anything?" Those words hit her harder than their actions. She looked at them, but she couldn't say anything. Her hands were shaking, and her heart was beating so hard she thought she was going to fall. She felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she didn't let them spill out. "Look at her," said the third, his voice filled with malice. "She wants to cry. It's just pathetic." There were footsteps again. This time they were closer, but no one turned around. The woman felt someone slowly approaching from behind, and her gaze briefly met the eyes of the man standing in front of her. His confidence wavered slightly, but he quickly regained his previous expression. "This is not your place," he repeated, but there was no longer the same confidence in his voice. The footsteps grew louder, and all three men turned. A figure appeared in the alley. The man was tall, his face hidden by a hood, but his confident posture made everyone freeze. The woman felt her heart stop in anticipation, but this time there was hope in that anticipation. "What's going on here?" the stranger asked, his voice low and cold. Those words, simple and direct, suddenly broke the tension in the air. The men began to retreat, their self-confidence evaporating, but the woman still did not move. She looked at the new man, as if she could not believe that someone had come. At that moment, she realized that her fear was being replaced by something else, a power that had always been with her, but until now could not find a way out. The hooded figure of the stranger stood a few feet away from the woman and the gang. The man, who had seemed so unshakable a moment ago, frowned for a moment, as if trying to determine who this man was and how he would change the course of their game. But their confusion was short-lived. The tallest of them stepped forward, the smirk returning to his face, as if he decided that the situation was still under control. "So what now?" he asked, his voice deliberately rough. "Have you decided to become her knight? Perhaps you think it's your business." The stranger did not answer immediately. He slowly removed his hood, revealing a stern but calm face. His eyes pierced the men, and for a moment their confidence wavered again. But then the second of them, standing a little further away, laughed loudly, trying to relieve the tension. "Look at him," he said, waving his hand at the stranger. "Thinks he can stop us. Do you even know who we are?" Meanwhile, the woman standing a little behind was trying to find a way out. Her gaze darted around the alley, but there was no escape. She knew that the stranger would not be able to change everything in her favor. She felt her breathing getting heavier, and her inner fear was starting to take over. "Go away," the third, youngest of the gang suddenly said, pointing at the stranger, "or you'll end up like her." The words cut the woman like a blow. They were spoken without a shadow of a doubt, with absolute certainty that no one and nothing could stop them. The stranger took a step forward. His gaze remained focused, but there was a threat in it that was impossible not to notice. "You've crossed the line already," he said, his voice low but steely, "and if you think I'm going to let you continue, you're wrong." But his words only angered the men. The first of them, the tallest, stepped forward again, his face contorted with anger. "You don't understand," he said, pointing to the woman standing behind the stranger. "She's not wanted here, and neither are you." The woman felt a chill run through her body. She could see that the situation was becoming increasingly tense, and her fear for herself and the stranger was growing stronger with each passing second. She tried to say something to defuse the situation, but her voice failed her. The men began to close in on the circle, their threats becoming more and more real. The stranger was prepared for the tension to escalate into conflict, but their superior numbers and aggression were weighing on him. The woman felt her hope slowly fading. "We have our own rules," said the second of the gang, grinning, "and if you're not going to respect them, you'll learn what it means to break them." The situation was getting tense. The footsteps and whispers of the crowd that could have been salvation never appeared. The woman stood still, feeling the darkness gathering around her. The stranger remained where he was, ready for any development, but she knew that one person was not enough to change this reality. She tried to find words to stop what was happening, but her voice was shaking. "Please," she began, but was interrupted by the rough laughter of one of the men. "Please," he asked, taking a step toward her, "is that all you can do? You've already lost." The words sounded like a death sentence. The stranger did not move, but his eyes betrayed the growing tension. He knew that this situation was getting out of control. The men began to advance, and the woman felt that time slowed down, each moment turning into an eternity. It was a moment when the future seemed unclear and the outcome inevitable. The air in the alley was silent, heavy and expectant, like before a storm. The noise of distant cars and raindrops pattering on the roofs only emphasized this painful moment of calm. The woman stood motionless, her breathing ragged, her heart beating in time with the roar of the street, and a circle of hatred and contempt closed around her. "Are you still here?" The voice of the tallest of the gang cut through the silence like a knife. His face was twisted in a smirk that left no room for doubt. He was enjoying every moment of her fear. "I thought you knew by now that it was best not to argue with us, but it seems you have something to say." He took a step forward, and his shadow fell on the woman. She instinctively retreated, but her back was already against the wall. The stranger who stood next to her frowned. His gaze remained firm, but he did not move. It seemed that he was waiting for the moment to intervene, but every moment of waiting was unbearable. You think you can be here? The other, younger member of the gang continued, his voice full of malice. This is our neighborhood. There's no place for your kind. Understand? He reached out and roughly poked her in the shoulder. The woman staggered, but regained her balance. She looked up, her gaze meeting his, but there was no challenge in it, only fear and despair. I don't want trouble, she said, her voice shaking, but still holding a faint note of self-defense. I just want to leave. Leave? Asked the third one, standing a little further away, his laughter cold and harsh. You're already here, which means you'll have to finish what started. He kicked her bag, which was lying on the ground, and its contents spilled out again. The groceries rolled across the wet pavement, and the woman instinctively bent down to collect them. But another blow, this time to her arm, made her freeze. She felt a sharp pain, but she didn't scream. She simply frowsy, her eyes full of tears that she desperately tried to hold back. Don't touch it, the tall one said, his voice harsh. It's not yours anymore. Why are you doing this? She whispered, her voice barely audible. She raised her head, her face wet from the rain and tears. What have I done to you? What have you done to us? The younger one asked, his voice full of mockery. You exist. That's enough. The words hit her harder than their actions. She felt her breathing become even more ragged. She knew that any words would only make things worse, but the silence seemed even more painful. She turned to the stranger, who still stood there, his gaze focused. Are you going to do something? One of the bandits shouted at the stranger. Or do you think you can just stand here and watch? I warned you, the stranger said, his voice low and menacing. If you don't back down, this will end badly for you. These words caused another burst of laughter. The men looked at each other, their confidence unshakable. You don't understand who you're dealing with, the tall man said, stepping closer to the stranger. We decide what happens here, and you're just another idiot who doesn't know his place. The woman tried to take advantage of the moment to step aside, but one of the men immediately noticed her movement. He grabbed her hand and pulled her back sharply. Where are you going? He said, his voice full of malice. We're not done yet. She felt the tears start to well up again, but she held them back. Her hands were shaking, but she kept her eyes on the stranger. There was something about him that gave her a tiny spark of hope, but that spark was slowly being extinguished by the pressure of what was happening. Listen, the stranger began, his voice firmer. You can't stop now. You still have a choice. A choice? One of the men asked, his voice full of mockery. We always have a choice, and we've already made it. He pushed the woman roughly, and she fell to the ground. Her arms were torn on the wet asphalt, but she tried to rise again. Her breathing was heavy, but she was not going to give in. The stranger took a step forward, but three men surrounded him, as if challenging him. You want to save her, the tall one said, his voice full of malice. Then you'll have to pay for it. The tension reached its peak. The woman lying on the ground felt her heart stop. She knew that the next moment would decide everything, but she could not predict how it would end. It was a moment when the whole world seemed to stop and the future remained shrouded in darkness. The rain grew heavier, as if the city itself was trying to wash away the filth of what was happening, but the alley remained a place where fear and tension thickened like fog. The woman lay on the wet pavement, her hands shaking, her eyes darting between the men and the stranger. Every new blow of the gang's words or actions tore at her hope, but deep inside there was something that refused to completely fade. You thought you could stop us? The tall man smirked, turning to face the stranger. His figure loomed like a shadow, his voice full of malice. Do you even realize you're standing on someone else's territory? The stranger stood motionless, his face calm but his eyes filled with a threat that was impossible to ignore. He didn't answer right away, and the silence, instead of diffusing the situation, only increased the tension. The gang began to shift from foot to foot, their grins becoming less confident, but they didn't back down. I don't think so, the stranger finally said, his voice low and confident. I know. You know, the younger man asked, his voice shaking, though he tried not to show it. And what do you know? I know you have a choice, the stranger replied, stepping forward, his figure filling the space between the woman and her tormentors. You can leave, right now. This brought another burst of laughter, but it was forced, as if the gang was trying to convince themselves that they were still in control. The woman on the ground felt her breathing become more even. Her hands were shaking, but she used the moment to rise to her knees. You think you can order us around? The tall man asked, his voice sharper. You don't even know who you're dealing with. No, the stranger replied, his tone calm but steely. It's you who don't know who you're dealing with. These words, spoken calmly and confidently, made the men freeze. For a moment, a shadow of doubt appeared in their eyes. The stranger took another step forward, his figure now completely obscuring the woman. She looked at his back, and hope began to appear in her heart again. But she did not dare to believe that this was the end. Maybe it's time we showed him what we think of his kind, the second man said, trying to regain his confidence. He took a step forward, but stopped when the stranger raised his hand. One step, he said, his voice almost a whisper, but every man heard him. One step, and you can't go back. There was silence in the air. The men looked at each other, their confidence beginning to fade. The tall man, who had always been the leader, looked at the stranger with suspicion. Who the hell are you? He asked, his voice full of irritation, but there was fear in it. What makes you think you can stop us? The stranger did not answer immediately. He took another step forward. Now he was standing directly in front of the tall man. Their eyes met. Do you think I'm here by accident? He finally asked. Do you really believe they'll let you continue this? These words sounded like thunder. The men looked at each other, their confidence completely gone. They felt that something was wrong, but they could not figure out what exactly. The woman, who was still kneeling, looked at what was happening with surprise. She did not know who this man was, but his words and actions inspired confidence. Okay, that's enough, the tall one shouted, trying to regain control. You want us to leave? Then you'll do it at our mercy. But the stranger did not move. His gaze remained focused, and his figure radiated a power that was impossible to ignore. This is not your grace, he said, his voice firmer. This is your last chance. The men looked at each other again, but now they began to retreat. Their steps were slow, and there was a fear in their eyes that they could not hide. The tall man paused for a moment, his gaze meeting the woman's. This isn't over, he said, his voice full of anger, but there was confusion in it. We'll be back. And with that he turned and walked away, followed by the others. The woman who had been kneeling finally rose, her body shaking, but she was able to stand up straight. The stranger turned to her, his face calm, but there was a spark of understanding in his eyes. Are you okay? He asked, his voice soft but with strength. The woman nodded, her voice shaking as she replied. Thank you. I don't know who you are, but thank you. The stranger said nothing. He looked toward the end of the alley where the men had disappeared, and then turned back to the woman. That's not all, he said quietly, but you can handle it. Now go on. The words, simple and sincere, sounded like a promise to her. She looked at him one last time, then gathered her things and headed for the exit of the alley. The stranger remained where he was, his gaze focused on the shadow where the gang had just stood. His work was not yet done. As the woman stepped out of the alley, her heart was still beating so fast that each beat echoed in her ears. The rain had become less intense, but cold drops still ran down her face, mixing with the remaining tears. She looked back, her gaze meeting the emptiness of the alley where the stranger remained. She felt grateful, but there was a fear that would not go away. The stranger still stood in the shadows. His form was still, as if he were part of the alley itself, watching what was to come next. He knew it wasn't over. The men were gone, but their looks, their threatening words, had left a mark that couldn't be erased. He knew these types too well. They would come back, and he was ready. In the distance, just out of earshot, came the sound of voices. The men who had just left had gathered in a group again. They stood across the street, silhouetted by the dim light of a street lamp. The dark figures shifted from foot to foot, their loud voices echoing in the night. The stranger listened, his face impassive. Did you see him? Came the voice of one of them, the younger one. He wasn't even scared. Shut up, the tall one snapped, his tone harsh but nervous. It doesn't matter. We should have ended it there. Then let's go back, the second one suggested, but there was uncertainty in his voice. He's alone. We can handle it. The stranger noticed how the tall man needed several seconds to answer. Those seconds showed more than any words. The man doubted, but his pride did not allow him to admit it. Yes, we will come back, he finally said, but not now. We will do it right. The footsteps and voices began to fade away. The stranger watched them, his eyes focused and his hands clenched into fists. He knew they wouldn't let this go. Their type never backed down. He'd seen it before. They couldn't afford to appear weaker, especially in front of those they considered beneath them. The woman stopped when she reached the corner of the street and leaned against the wall. Her legs were shaking, and she tried to calm her breathing. She felt her fear fading, but it was not gone completely. She knew that this night would be with her for a long time. Her gaze fell back on the alley, and she saw that the stranger was still there. He stood as if guarding the place, and it filled her with a strange sense of safety. "They'll come back," she said quietly, as if talking to herself, but her voice carried through the night, and the stranger heard her. He turned, his gaze meeting hers. She didn't know what to read in his eyes, but there was no fear in them, only confidence. "I know," he replied, his voice firm but calm, "but they don't know that I do either." Those words made her heart clench. She realized that this man was not just a random passerby. He was someone who understood what fear was and how to deal with it, but she didn't know if he would be able to cope when they returned, because this time they would not act impulsively. They would come with a plan. She took a step forward, but then stopped, her feet flouncy, as if she were rooted to the spot. She wanted to say something, but she didn't know what the right words would be. The stranger nodded at her, as if telling her that she didn't need to say anything. It was enough for him that she was safe. He turned again and walked deeper into the shadows of the alley. The woman was alone, her hands still shaking, but she knew she had to keep going. She began to move, her steps slow but determined. This night had changed her. She would never be the same again. In the alley, the stranger stopped. He listened to the night, his gaze fixed on the spot where the men had disappeared. He had to be ready. He knew this was only the beginning. The night in the city continued to envelop the streets in a thick blanket of silence, broken only by the occasional sound of footsteps and the distant hum of cars. The stranger remained in the alley, his figure merging with the shadows, as if he were a part of this gloomy space. He did not move, his eyes carefully studying the end of the street, where the figures of the men had disappeared. His gaze was focused and cold. The rain had died down, but the air remained damp and heavy, filling the space with a tension that seemed to be physically palpable. Somewhere nearby, a light flared in one of the courtyards, bright and harsh. The woman, who had managed to retreat to a safe distance, stopped when she heard the slamming of doors. Her heart began to beat faster again. She knew she was no longer in danger, but something about that night had left a mark that would not let go. Her legs trembled, but she kept moving. She could not stay still while her mind was filled with images of those men, their voices, their threats. She could not forget their looks, full of hatred and contempt. Meanwhile, the gang that had left the alley just minutes before had gathered elsewhere. They stood in a circle under the dim light of a lantern, their faces a mixture of anger and embarrassment. They were not used to feeling vulnerable. The tall man, who had always been the leader, looked toward the alley, his jaw clenched, his eyes full of determination. "This guy thinks he can stop us," he said, his voice low but furious. "He just doesn't know who he's dealing with." "Yeah, but he was weird," the younger of them muttered, his voice shaking. "Did you see the way he looked? He wasn't scared at all." "Because he's an idiot," the tall one said sharply, turning to him. "We should have taken him out right away. We gave him a chance, and now he thinks he can be a hero. But tomorrow will be different." "And she?" asked another, pointing in the direction where the woman had disappeared. "We just leave it like this." The tall man frowned. His face turned cold as stone. He didn't want to admit that the retreat was weakness, but he also knew that this man and the all-eyed stranger who dared to challenge them had changed the game. "We'll be back," he said, his voice firm, "but we'll do it right this time. We'll show him and everyone else who's boss." In the alley, the stranger seemed to sense their mood. His gaze remained fixed on the spot where they had disappeared, but now he began to move. His steps were slow but sure, his shadow gliding along the walls like a predator preparing to pounce. He knew they would return. It was inevitable, but he was not going to back down. He stopped at the edge of the street, his gaze falling to the ground where a few groceries from the woman's spilled bag still lay. He picked up one of the oranges, squeezed it lightly in his hand, then carefully placed it back. The simple gesture was filled with meaning that only he understood. To him, it was a symbol of why he was here, not for revenge, but for something greater. There was a noise in the distance, and he looked up instantly. They were footsteps, approaching too quickly to be accidental. His body tensed, and he stepped to the side, into the shadows, to become invisible. The streetlights barely illuminated the street. but he knew that this place would become the site of another battle. The men reappeared on the street, their silhouettes clearly visible in the streetlight. They walked confidently, but their steps betrayed growing tension. They did not know what to expect, but their pride and anger drove them forward. A tall man stopped at the edge of the alley, his eyes trying to penetrate the darkness. "Where is he?" he said, his voice low, almost a whisper, but everyone heard it. The stranger stood in the shadows, watching them. He knew they wouldn't go away that easily this time. His gaze was cold, his breathing even. He was ready. This night wasn't over yet, and its outcome depended on how far each of them was willing to go. The alley, lit only by the dim light of a distant street lamp, seemed empty and quiet, but the silence was deceptive. It hid the tension that was growing with each passing second. The woman stood at the back of the street, her gaze focused, her breathing evened out. The trembling in her hands had disappeared, as had the fear that had gripped her body just a few minutes ago. She knew this was far from over, but now everything was different. She was no longer a victim. Footsteps could be heard from afar. The booming, heavy rhythm of boots filled the alley, as if announcing the approach of danger. The men of the gang, who had only recently left her with a sense of false victory, were returning. Their voices, angry and mocking, echoed off the brick walls. They could not afford to leave, knowing that their power was being questioned. "Well, is she still here?" the tall man said, his tone sarcastic. "Maybe she's waiting for us. She couldn't have gone far," added another, looking around. "People like her never know when to just disappear." The woman took a step forward, her shadow slowly moving out from its hiding place. She was no longer trying to hide. Her face, illuminated by the moonlight, looked calm, but her eyes held a confidence that had been hidden by fear before. The men stopped when they saw her. Their smirks returned, as if they had decided that this time would be easy. "Are you still here?" The tall one laughed loudly, his voice cutting through the silence. "It's brave, but stupid, or she decided we'd give her a second chance," the younger one added, the grin on his face growing wider. The woman didn't answer. Her gaze was fixed on their faces, her breathing even. She knew that words meant nothing now. The only thing that mattered was her actions, and she was ready. "I think we should remind her how the rules work here," the second man said, stepping forward. "You don't belong here." "Okay." They began to close in on her, their movements confident but lacking caution. They thought of her as weak, helpless, someone who would never be able to stand up to them. But they didn't know who she was. They didn't know what she was capable of. "Go away," she finally said, her voice quiet but menacing. "This is your only chance." These words caused another burst of laughter. The men looked at each other, their eyes full of mockery. "Are you serious?" the tall one asked, his voice rough. "Are you threatening us? This is ridiculous." He took another step toward her, reaching out to grab her, but before he could touch her, she moved. Her movements were quick, precise, as if honed by thousands of hours of training. She grabbed his wrist, twisted his arm to the side, and pushed his body forward with such force that he lost his balance and fell to his knees. "What?" one of the men shouted, his eyes widening in surprise. The woman turned to face them, her gaze focused, her body poised for the next move. The man frowned for a moment, unsure of what had just happened, but the confusion was short-lived. The second man lunged at her, his face twisted in rage, but she was ready. She ducked his blow, his fist missing her face, and her elbow caught him in the chest with such force that he fell backwards, gasping. "She," the younger one began, his voice shaking, "is she some kind of soldier?" His words caused a new wave of fear among the others. The calm man rose to his feet, clenching his fists, his face turned red, and his eyes burned with anger. "You think you can beat us?" he shouted, his voice growing louder. "You will achieve nothing. We will break you." The woman didn't answer. She knew that words no longer mattered. They could say anything, but their actions betrayed their fear. She saw how their movements became more cautious, how their confidence began to fade. They rushed at her again, trying to outnumber her, but she moved quickly and accurately. Her blows were powerful, each one leaving the men confused and in pain. One by one they fell to the ground, their confidence completely gone. Only the tall one remained, his face now pale, his eyes full of fear. "Who are you?" he whispered, stepping back. "What are you?" "I'm the one you underestimated," she replied, her voice firm. "And that's your mistake." The man didn't have time to say more. He turned and ran, his footsteps echoing in the empty alley. The woman remained standing among the scattered bodies of his comrades. She evened out her breathing. Her gaze remained focused. That night was her ally, and now she knew that she had proven to herself that strength was not only physical strength, but also self-confidence. She bent down, gathered her back, and walked out of the alley. Her steps were steady. Her heart was calm. She knew she would never be afraid again. That night, she had not only changed her world, but reminded those around her that true fear comes to those who underestimate the strength of a person who fights for themselves. Heavy breathing and echoes of pain hung in the air like an invisible haze. The men of the gang lay on the wet asphalt of the alley, each of them feeling aching pain in their bodies. But most of all, they were tormented by a feeling that had previously seemed impossible to them, fear. This fear grew inside them, filling their hearts with a dull thud of panic, making them tremble and look at the woman with a horror they could not hide. She stood motionless, her breathing even, her figure straight. Her eyes, cold and emotionless, looked at them, as if she was evaluating whether to continue. "Oh, who are you?" the tall one croaked, trying to rise to his feet, but his hands were shaking and his legs felt like cotton wool. He saw before him not the woman they had considered easy prey, but a force they could not understand. The woman didn't answer. Her silence was louder than any words. She stepped forward slowly, her boots leaving tracks in the puddles that were already mixed with mud and blood. The men instinctively retreated, their bodies moving slowly, as if they didn't believe they could get away. We didn't mean to," the younger one began, his voice shaking as he took another step back. His eyes darted around, as if he were looking for an exit, but there was no escape in this alley. "It was a mistake. We didn't know who you were." "You didn't know," the woman finally spoke, her voice quiet but with steel in it. "And if you had known, would you have acted differently, or would you have simply chosen someone else for your games?" Her words were like a whip cutting through the air. The men looked at each other, their faces twisted in fear. They didn't know what to say. The confidence that had fueled their actions before was now completely shattered. They felt small, helpless, trapped. The tall one tried to speak again, but his voice caught in his throat. He looked at his comrades, hoping for support, but saw only his fear reflected in their eyes. "Hey, we can just leave," he said, his voice hoarse and weak. "No one got hurt. We didn't mean any harm." The woman stopped, her eyes fixed on him, her face impassive, but there was disappointment in her gaze. "No one was hurt?" she asked, her voice a little louder but still cold. "Do you think your words can erase what you've done? Do you think it will all be over if you just leave?" The words plunged the alley into even greater silence. The men couldn't take their eyes off her, but each of them felt their world crumbling. Their actions, which had once seemed like strength, now revealed their weakness. They could no longer hide behind their numbers, their brutality. It was all exposed. "We didn't mean to," the younger one whispered, his voice barely audible. "You didn't want to," she repeated, her voice even colder. "You didn't want to, but you did it anyway. You didn't want to, but you thought you could walk away, leaving behind the pain and fear you had sown." The tall one stepped forward, trying to regain at least a shadow of control, but his legs were buckling and his face expressed only despair. "Look," he began, his hands raised in a conciliatory gesture. "We made a mistake. Give us a chance. We'll never." She interrupted him by taking a sharp step forward. Her movement was quick, and he instinctively stepped back, tripping and falling to the ground. "A chance," she said, her voice quiet, but there was a power in that silence that made it go silent. "Did you like it when I asked you to leave? Did you like it when I tried to defend myself with words? Where was my chance?" The tall man was silent, his gaze fixed on the ground. His comrades stood behind him, their faces pale, their hands clenched into fists, not from anger, but from helplessness. "Now you understand what it means to be vulnerable," she said, her voice softer but still strong. "You thought strength was oppressing those weaker than you, but real strength is knowing when to stop." She stepped back, her figure still radiating a confidence that overwhelmed them. The men did not move. Their bodies seemed frozen in place. She looked at them one last time and added, "Go away, and never again think that you can break someone for your own pleasure." The men, without a word, began to retreat. Their steps were uneven, their heads were down. The fear they felt was new to them, and it left an imprint they would not forget. Their vulnerability became their reality, and each of them knew that this night would change them forever. The woman was left alone in the alley. Her breathing became even, her heart slowed. She picked up her bag, which was still lying on the ground, and headed towards the exit of the alley. There was no longer fear in her eyes, only a firm conviction that she would never again allow anyone to make her feel weak. The night slowly gave way to dawn, but in this alley, time seemed to stand still. After the confrontation with the woman, who had shattered all their notions of their own power, the men of the gang tried to run, to hide in the darkness of the night. Their steps were fast, their breath was ragged, and each of them felt the fear filling their bodies, leaving an emptiness in its wake. No words were exchanged, nothing remained between them now except the awareness of their own vulnerability. The tall man, who had always been their leader, tried to suppress the trembling in his hands. His thoughts were confused, but one feeling was clear. He was no longer in control. His pride, his strength, his power, all of it had evaporated, leaving him alone. He knew he had to run, but where, and from whom? There was a hidden truth in that question that he was afraid to admit. Across the street, hidden in the shadows, a woman watched their hasty escape. Her gaze was calm, but there was a steely determination in her eyes. She knew that simply letting them go was letting them continue. These men who had turned their fear into a weapon against others needed to face justice, not just for her sake, but for the sake of everyone who had ever suffered at their hands. She took out her phone, dialed the number, and her voice sounded firm. "The police. I want to report a group of people who tried to attack me. I have evidence, and I am ready to testify." Her words were the beginning of the end for the gang. Within minutes, the streets were filled with the sound of sirens, their cold wail cutting through the silence of the night. The men who thought they had escaped frenzy as headlights blared through the darkness. They were not prepared for anyone to challenge them, much less bring them to justice. The calm man turned, his face contorted in horror. The policemen stepped out of their cars, their voices loud and confident. "Everyone stay where you are, hands up." They knew it was useless to resist. One by one, the men raised their hands, their faces pale and their eyes shining with fear. This fear they had inspired in others for so long was now their own reality. The woman stepped out of the shadows, her figure illuminated by the headlights. She no longer felt afraid. Every step she took was filled with the strength she had gained at night. She stopped in front of the police officers and pointed at the men. "It's them. They attacked me. I have everything I need to confirm it." The police nodded, their actions swift and precise. The men of the gang were handcuffed, their faces expressing a mixture of anger and despair. The tall man, who had always considered himself the leader, now stood with his head down, his shoulders slumped, and his voice, which had once been loud and commanding, was now barely audible. "Hey, we didn't want." But the woman looked at him with cold firmness. "You wanted, and you did, but never again." The words sounded like a death sentence. The men were taken away by the police, their figures disappearing into the darkness of the police cars. The woman was left standing on the street, her face calm, but there was something more in her heart. This was not just a victory over them. This was a victory over the fear they tried to instill in her. When dawn finally broke over the horizon, she knew that this night had changed everything, not just for her, but for everyone who had ever been targeted by their kind. She knew that justice had been served, and now she would move on, strong, free, and confident that good could prevail even in the darkest alleys. Friends, what do you think about this story? Have there been situations of injustice in your life or moments when you faced something similar? We want to know your thoughts and stories in the comments. Your opinion is important to us, and each of you is incredibly valuable to us. We appreciate your support, for being with us, and for being able to talk about such important things together. If this story touched you, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and like it. It helps us to continue sharing stories like this. We wish you a wonderful day and justice in every life.